And hello, everybody. My name is Carlos Siqueira. I'm the leader of the Salesforce Architect group in Tampa. This is a monthly event here where we bring CTAs, architects, and people very well respected. I couldn't find somebody bigger, taller, or more famous than Carl. He's a Salesforce MVP. He's a Salesforce CTA. So with that said, Carl, take it away. It's yours.
Thanks, Carlos. So for today's session, I know we teased this as 3.5 billion records, but it's been so long since Carlos and I first discussed that actually I looked at this customer today and we're up to 5 billion records that I've archived and deleted. So I'm excited to talk about this today. If you don't know me, a little bit about my background. I'm a principal technical architect at Otiseva. So we spend a lot of time working with customers on data and especially challenges with lots and lots of data, hundreds of millions, billions of records in their org. Also a CTA MVP. I'll have lots of certifications and have spent a lot of time working with CRM. It's CRM Analytics now, was Tableau CRM, was Einstein Analytics, was Wave, the whole analytics platform. And I'm located up in the Allentown, Pennsylvania area where I co-lead developer group with Peter Knoll. So during today's discussion, please jump in with the chat if you have questions, if something isn't clear, if you want to share a similar experience, talk through that. I'd much rather have this be an interactive session than just me talking the whole time. And obviously, if we have time at the end, we will tackle any questions then too. So the reaction I usually get is I say, wait, you've deleted 5 billion records. I've got a lot of questions for you. I need to understand more. How does this happen in Salesforce? So the one I usually start with is, why did we do this? What was going on that necessitated it? So I had a customer that is in the transportation industry. So you can think about movements of goods from one place to another around the world. And they had done a Salesforce project where they were bringing their service centers onto Salesforce. And they had started with a small number of service folks in one country. And that went really well for them. They were able to use things like email to case, a lot of the service console, all the features that you hear about in the service side. And what they had done was they had then expanded globally. So they had about 10,000 service users that were processing really requests almost every hour of the day. If you can imagine, they're kind of doing a follow the sun type service center where they would have Europe, America, and then Asia Pacific. And what happened one day is service stopped working. You could no longer get an email into Salesforce, and you could no longer send an email from Salesforce. And I wasn't actually the one who designed the system originally, but we came in when this happened because who wants to guess? What do you think went wrong with their service implementation that stopped all of the emails from coming and going in the org? And you can jump in, unmute yourself. You can type in the chat. I'm interested to see.
Could be limitation due to the fact that they probably have 5,000 caps to send mass emails.
Okay, so mass emails would be one thing. What are some other ideas? So we look. The other thing I hear a lot of times is, oh, you probably hit a limit. You probably ran out of storage space or you ran out of file space. But this customer with the license that they had terabytes worth of space. What actually happened, it was similar to a file or storage limit, but it was something that was really obscure. Salesforce has a limit of the number of files or content bodies you can have in an org, and it was 30 million. And if you haven't worked with email to case before, what actually starts happening is every time you receive a message, an email message, anything that's attached to that message gets created as a file. And you might think, oh, well, people aren't sending that many files. But if it's coming from business to business and they have a little Twitter, follow us on Twitter, follow us on LinkedIn, all those things get turned into a file. Every time you send out an email as a customer service rep that said, follow us on Twitter, all those things got created as a file. And guess what? There wasn't intelligence built into Salesforce. It could be 10 million copies of that same little Twitter icon versus having one file that's shared. So what happened was they hit that limit of 30 million files in the org, and everything stopped because you would try to receive a message, you'd try to create a file, it'd say over your limit and stop. So they talked to Salesforce, and Salesforce granted them a temporary relief. It was one of the softer limits that's out there, and said, you can go up to 100 million, but that's it. Once you hit 100 million, you have to have another solution in place. You have to have a way to archive this information from your org. So next question comes from the why is, I told you a little bit about the who, so a global transportation company working around the sun, the service center side of it. The what did we need to archive? So the place that we started, because what was driving the volume was cases, because every email would create a case. And at the point where we got involved, they had about 30 million cases in the org and about 30 million files. So it was, some cases had a few files, a lot of cases had many of it. And what they decided in the analysis that they were doing was they really needed to get the case, the related email message, and the related files out as quickly as possible. So that's what we needed to do. And we can go into some of the lessons about, well, if you're going to take a case, you may need to think a little bit broader. But that was the starting point. So where did we need to do it from? Well, we needed to get it out of their production org, which is kind of interesting. You don't always go and start developing in production. But if you're dealing with something where you have millions of records that you need to remove, you're not exactly going to put that in a developer org. Or if you need to ask for a full sandbox, customers aren't always having just a spare full copy sandbox sitting along the side. So there was an element of doing some development orgs, but then quickly really needing to test against a full copy or production org in order to make sure we could handle some of the performance characteristics. The other thing that came into mind when we talk about where, this being a global company, was when we remove the data, where does it need to live? Because it was actually European headquarters, and that's where their Salesforce org was, the decision was made that any information that came out, well, that needed to go into the local European instance. Couldn't leave the borders of Europe. So when did we need to do it? Well, of course, we need to do it immediately, right? Because there's the concept of we hit a limit, our system isn't working, we have temporary relief. And the way we looked at this problem, I like to break it into two categories. I like to think about, okay, what needs to be your ongoing steady state? If your system was perfectly aligned, how many cases do you get in every day? That's cases that we need to archive every day. So in this customer, it was around 150, 160, 170,000 cases. So that kind of keeps your system from growing. It gets you to a steady state, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't bring you down. It doesn't resolve the problem. So you have to also think about the backlog. How are we going to get 20 million cases out of the org as part of the backlog, along with 160,000 cases every day? So you can see the longer that you wait for something like an archiving project, the more challenging the numbers become. So how did we go about doing this? Well, being an architect at Odaseva, we had some technology that would help with it. But beyond the technology, I can talk through the thought process. And the thought process is there's really 3 steps to an archiving project. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to do identification. You're going to move into archival, and then you're going to move into delete. So what are these 3 phases? Identification is where you're going to figure out what can you actually remove. And oftentimes the criteria, it starts out sounding very simple, like, oh, just get rid of all cases older than 2 years. And something like that, you can probably write a SOCL statement that is selective, meaning it's going to perform based off of the size of the data that you have. If you're taking 160,000 out of 2 million, yeah, that's probably going to use an index and it's going to come back. But inevitably, that criteria quickly gets complicated. So for example, the rule for this customer, while it started as older cases of this particular type, it quickly became and has no open subcases and doesn't have an escalation associated with it. So now you have this very complex SOQL statement that needs to look across multiple objects, and you're not going to be able to just run that and have it perform on such large data volumes. So you have to think about other ways that you can come up with identification and know the records that you want. The archival step is where we're going to take information out of Salesforce and we're going to put it somewhere. We're going to need to remove things like the case, the related records, and then interestingly, the binaries. How do you take a file that's stored in Salesforce as a blob, so a record, data inside of a record, and put it into a file that you can view somewhere? And there's some challenges that we'll look at those next. So then once you have the copy, then you need to come back and say, hey, we want to delete these things. We want to go ahead and remove the case, remove the file, and so forth. And what's interesting is if you think about a global company, you may not be able to run these things at the same time. You may not be able to do a delete at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. You may have to push that into off hours or off hours of low activity. So we'll take a look at how we can optimize for that as well too. All right. So before I go in, any questions so far? Are we kind of on board with the challenge that laid in front of us and what we needed to accomplish?
One quick question. Is there a way to avoid such kind of situation?
So one of my lessons later on is think archiving at the start.
At the start,
so
right?
If excuse me, if you wait until you have this problem, it's already too late. So one of the things on my projects, if we talk about putting data into Salesforce, I actually won't put it in until we talk about when does it reach the end of life? How do we remove it? Is it 3 days? Is it 3 years? Is it some combination? So that's part of the initial discussions of if it's going to be created, when and how is it going to get destroyed, so that if you can foresee these things coming instead of have to react to it, because it's always easier to plan and build something in than it is to be in a crisis mode and try and figure out how can you deal with it. Because honestly, at crisis time, there's only so many hours in the day for processes to run, and you can only get so much out of Salesforce so fast. There's some hard limits that you just can't get around, and it will take time in order to get back to a steady state.
Carl, I have a question here. If you hit that amount into the Salesforce, the data that needs to be readily available, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to archival, that probably years back you call that data warehouse. You take data from your environment and you put somewhere else where you can access as you need. What would be one of the options in there? To push that to AWS, push that to Google?
Yeah, so you're hitting on this question first, and then we'll talk about some of the mechanisms.
Okay.
But know the why. Why are you trying to archive? Is it because the data is obsolete, but you have a regulatory requirement that says you need to keep it for 7 years? So for example, does the opportunity that you closed 5 years ago really matter to the business, or the case that you closed 6 years ago? Maybe not, but you have a regulation in a country. If you start looking at some of the Asia Pacific countries, it can be 30 years. Do you really want to keep that in Salesforce for 30 years to meet a regulatory requirement? Probably not. So that's one archive pattern where you're saying, I'm just going to put it somewhere and I don't need to access it on a regular course of business. I don't need to look at it. I may need to retrieve it if we have a legal action or if we have something atypical. So those type of scenarios, putting it into a file format, putting it into S3, putting it into a similar version on Azure, where you have it encrypted, you have it secure, you have it parked, and you can find it. That meets the regulatory reasons. Now, in our scenario that we're discussing, it's a little bit different. We've hit a limit fairly quickly, within a year of using Salesforce, that makes Salesforce inoperable. So in this situation, knowing that a customer raised a case a year ago, that's kind of important. You can't really just abstract that and park it on an S3 instance somewhere and infrequently access it. You want to see that. You want to be able to view the archive data. So at that point, you're looking at some type of online system, whether it be a database, whether it be an external object that then is exposed back into Salesforce where you can see it. In Otiseva, we have a live archive is what we call the product that we offer, where we let you view the information in Salesforce right on the record. So it's just another related list, but it's reading from the archive and you can see all the archive cases. So when you have that business need to still see the information, but you've hit a Salesforce limit, then you're going to put in a different type of architecture or different way of storing the information. So that's why it's important to know, why are you doing this? The other thing that comes into mind related, knowing who needs access to data. So the access patterns, like I said, with something like compliance, it's going to be infrequent, probably administrator. If it's a business need, then it could be very frequent, and it could be all of your service representatives. Who's going to need to see what? Or is there security in place? Can everybody see everything in the archive, or do you need to follow some of the security model? And then how much? How much data are you putting in the archive? What's the performance going to be like? If it's once a year you're looking for something, and if it takes 3 hours, that's fine. If it's a service rep that wants to look up a past case, you probably are looking for second response time. So those things really come into designing what you want as the solution. So that's the first lesson, is know the why. Questions there? All right. The second thing is you have to embrace the concept of big numbers. And what do I mean by that? Well, me talking about archiving 150, let's call it 200,000 cases, that's not really that scary, right? Most people like, okay, that's a big number, but 200,000 doesn't sound too bad. But if you think about it, when you take a case, you're going to take related information. You're going to take case comments. You're going to take case feed. You're going to take files. You're going to take case history. You may have custom objects in there. So those 200 cases, they could be a factor of 5, 10, 20x or more. So in my example, actually 200,000 cases equaled about it was like roughly it's 1.4 million. So it was almost like a 5 to 6x factor. And what happens is, if you think about that, okay, let's say I have to do 7 million records a day total. Well, very rarely do you implement a project in a day or a week or a month. So that backlog of cases that you need to process, if your project takes a week, now you're looking at 28. If it takes a month, now you're looking at 124. If it takes a quarter, you're looking at 375 million records. So that's the thing it's sometimes hard to think that big and embrace it, but the power of related compounding what you have to do and the compounding of time can take your project from something that seems very manageable to now, wow, I really have to think about how am I going to get out that big of a backlog because it took a quarter. So the question before, how do you avoid it, right? You get ahead of it, because now if you have to delay an extra quarter, you've doubled from 374 to 750 million records. And that's very realistic, because now if you think about projects, sometimes in large companies, they need to get approved. They need to get funded. Oh, the team's not ready. Oh, this is our sprint release process. Oh, that has to go through change control. So it took a time to get through some of these changes. So questions on big numbers. Maybe if anybody's experienced something similar, definitely go ahead and share that. All right. So then my next tip is understanding Salesforce data, and specifically how Salesforce queries and handles what's inside of an org, because this can definitely change how you archive and then later how you delete. And the first thing is really looking at what we'll call selectivity. So this is how Salesforce writes a query against your objects. So if you say something like, give me all cases that have closed in the last 2 months. Well, it actually will identify and say, is there an index on this field? And not all fields are indexed, but something like close date or last modified date, it's definitely indexed. But it has to have few enough records to actually use that index. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you have over 1 million records, there's one threshold. If you have over 5 million, there's another. And essentially, if you're under 300 or so thousand records, it'll return to you. If you go over that number, it's going to say, well, I'm just going to scan your whole table. And scanning the whole table takes a long time. So there's tricks that you have to put in where if you wanted to archive those 5 million records of history, you're better off going in chunks of 200, 300,000 than trying to do them all at once. So being able to break processes into parallel executions where you can go at 200,000 3 times, right, to get to 600,000, and knowing how Salesforce will do it. That's a big key from getting out the data versus watching all of your processes time out. So that's one part. The second is the concept of data skew. And if you haven't experienced skew in Salesforce, there's lots of different kinds. There's data, there's ownership, there's master detail or lookup. But the idea that is one object can own too many of something else. If it's a ownership, one user has more than 10,000 records. If it's a parent-child relationship, one has more than 10,000 children records. What was happening in this particular customer's org, they allowed internal users to create cases on behalf of customers. So what happened was they would park a ton of cases on their own Salesforce account record. So they had a company Salesforce account, and that's where all these cases would get. So there was millions of cases that had just one account associated with it. So that created an enormous amount of data skew, and that can affect how your system locks if you start deleting, how you query it, because it will impact the ability to pull out children record and go through the tree. So know what you have going on there. And then knowing what's related. So cascade delete. Cascade delete is one of those things where if you delete a master, it will delete the children. You can also have that enabled in your org on lookup relationships. Typically, lookup relationships won't do that, but you can open up a case with Salesforce. You can say, hey, I want to enable lookup relationships to cascade delete. So what does that mean? It has two implications. One, obviously, on the delete side, you don't need to delete both case and case comment. Just deleting case will take care of it. But you need to be complete in the objects that you're archiving. If you miss one of those objects that is in a cascade delete, the second that you go and delete the case, you're going to lose that record in the other object. So it's very important to understand that, know what's going to happen so that you have a complete set of information. Otherwise, you could potentially lose data, and we don't want that to happen. So questions on those concepts for Salesforce data and maybe the more obscure things if you haven't seen those before?
If customer is creating so many cases on one account, is there any way to identify such situation?
So you can look in this particular customer, they had CRM analytics. So they found it more advantageous to have the data in CRM analytics and report off of it, because if you tried to run SQL queries, they would just time out. So that was one way. They would take the count of distinct, they would take the account and they would count the number of cases that were associated with it. So that was one way. There's not something in Salesforce that kind of pops up and stops you from doing it. It will let you do it.
Okay.
You need to be proactively looking for it. What I'll do, I'll grab the URL for this and put it in the chat. But this is the cheat sheet that was linked in here from a query perspective. And you can see, if you're looking at a standard index, well, of the first million records, you're going to look at 30%. And then the second, it's going to be 15%. And then there's some final threshold. So if you were trying to pull 1.1 million records and you had more than 5.6, it would say, nope, I'm not going to use your index. I'm going to do a query scan. And the same thing, there's different thresholds for custom. The thresholds are a lot lower. So these are the things that, if you're working with 1,000 records, you don't necessarily have to even be aware of. Everything works and it comes back. But when you're dealing in the tens of millions or billions, those come into play. All right, my next lesson learned is files in Salesforce, they are hard to deal with. So if we think about files, the newer version, not the old classic attachments, there's actually 3 objects in play. There's a content document object, which you can think about the header information. Hey, this is a PDF. The name is shipping invoice PDF. Here's who created it. Here's the size and so forth. There is then a child object called content version, which has the actual binary information. If you revise a file, you can actually have multiple versions. You could have 10 versions of it. Most people don't use that feature, but sometimes they do, usually around account planning or a contract going back and forth. You can see the different revisions. That just holds the information about it. The content document link then says, hey, this file is related to this case or this email message or this customer, so this account or contact. What is particularly nasty about content document link is there's some special access rules. You can't just go to content document link and say, select star from content document link. You have to always have a where clause that specifies either specific ID or a in clause of multiple IDs, or the document ID. So you either need to say, I want content document link based off of the entity that it's linked to, or I want content document link based off of the doc ID. So this is, again, not a place where you can just go and query and say, oh, I have these 10 million files that are all the same thing, and I can manipulate this object very easy and repoint them here, there. No, you have to be able to query it, not one by one, but you need to be able to systematically requery that over and over again based off of all your content documents or all of your other entities like a case or an email message. The other thing that challenges you when it comes time to pulling out files is files themselves aren't supported in bulk. You can't use the bulk API or the bulk 2 API and say, well, give me out these 5 million files. What it'll say is, well, we don't support the blob object, or it's called blob's binary large object block. It's just the way that it serializes a file into something that gets stored in a database. So instead, you have to go through REST and you have to go one by one. You're going to have to iterate through every file, download it through REST, store it as the PDF, the Word document, the image. So your speed of archiving files is going to be completely dependent upon the size of the files. And I'll let people wager a guess, which is worse, multiple small files or fewer large files in Salesforce from a performance perspective. So what do you think is the worst performance? You can chat it or you can speak up.
Yeah, I think fewer files with the larger size would be much more complicated to handle because of their tendency to time out quicker.
Okay. Anybody want to vote for multiple small? We'll hear the counter argument. There we go. So definitely fewer large presents the not so much a performance challenge, but a management challenge of if you time out or if you drop the connection, you need to have a process that can resume, that you can pick up from where you were and take that stream of information, not having to restart. But overall, it's faster to download a large file that's 10 megs than to do 10 1 meg files. So when you have all these little email messages that are tied to signatures and logos, there's this proliferation of lots of little files. So that actually took longer to pull out for this customer than if we had a bigger. So for example, where somebody put an invoice in a PDF or took a picture of some damage to a shipment, those were faster to download than having all these little ones. So a little bit counterintuitive sometimes, but those are the things that you run into with files. Anybody else have some file stories that they want to share, challenges that they've run into?
Okay, so I have just one question. So you
Sure.
mentioned that they ran into a limit of 30 million files in
Uh-huh.
their. So is that limit different than the storage limit of the files? Like, and how
Yes.
do they differ?
So let me see if I can bring this up. So they had several terabytes of file storage based off of their user licenses. So they were not close to that particular limit. But what you have is you have this Salesforce CRM content limit. And what we can come down to here is content, the maximum number of files, and that's set to 30 million. And what actually is interesting, there was a version of this help article that said this could be raised. Now I don't see it anymore. So the time when they were working here, this was not a limit that you could change. Salesforce for a while said that it was adjustable, but now I don't see that verbiage here on the help article. But it was a soft limit. So if you think about it, if we have 30 million 1K little files from an email, then yeah, we're not going to come close to terabytes of data, but we're going to hit the number very quickly. And that's exactly what happened to them.
How you identified that this is the limit which is causing an issue?
So that was more looking at the particular org and seeing what was going on, and what happens is in the data storage screen, at the top you have the amount of data that you've used, the amount of files, and it lists objects. And down at the bottom, it was content bodies. It's actually not even called files or content documents. It's called content bodies. And that's where they were at, like 30 million and one. So it was one of those kind of with, I didn't diagnose it. The customer wasn't working with us on that, but they went and worked with their Salesforce team. So they had a Salesforce program architect, and that's what they found. So I don't know if there was a particular error message that came up in the logs, but it was looking at the used content bodies that led to this particular finding.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So the next thing we need to think about, we've figured out how to identify the data. We've gotten some data out. We've dealt with cascade deletes, or excuse me, cascade relationships. We've dealt with skew. We've dealt with files. Is when it comes time to delete, there's actually 3 stages of delete. Hold on one second. I'm going to cough. There's actually 3 stages of delete. Most people are familiar with the recycle bin, where if you delete something, it's going to change the is deleted to true on the record itself, and it's going to be in the recycle bin. That will stay there for up to 15 days. There are some options to have an extended recycle bin, but if your recycle bin becomes too full, it'll automatically start purging things, and the record will move into a hard deleted state. Or you can use the bulk API and you can move right to hard delete. So the difference here, recycle bin, you're going to be able to see the record. You're going to have all the fields. Is deleted is the only thing that's different. A hard delete, you only have the ID. Now, what starts to happen is records have not actually left the Salesforce underlying Oracle database yet. There is a purge process that Salesforce runs, or a sweeper process, that will then take and remove that from the underlying database system. And that runs on a regular basis, and it doesn't have specific performance criteria that's listed in an SLA or listed in an article. It can be anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours. If you're in a sandbox, it can be weeks. If you have a ton of data that you deleted, it can take longer than a few hours. But until that's removed, that record still physically exists So it's counting against you for any additional queries you're doing. So the database itself hasn't re-indexed yet. It hasn't removed it. Your indexes aren't up to date. So if you do subsequent queries, you can still have a performance penalty for these, I'll call it orphaned records that have been deleted but have not actually been purged out of the system. And there's some Salesforce articles that talk about that, but it's really an obscure case when you're dealing with very large data volumes that you need to think about those things and know that just because I deleted it and I emptied the recycle bin or I hard deleted it, it's not immediately gone from the Salesforce systems, and that can figure into things like your query performance. So questions on that one? Or has anybody run into that? Okay, so the next thing is when it comes time to thinking about deleting, this is where you can't work against Salesforce. You have to use some of the features that it has to your advantage. Cascade delete is probably the biggest thing. If we think about, well, if we want to archive 20 million records, we need to be as performant as possible. So rather than deleting each object in a relationship, I can delete just the case and have it remove the other pieces. But what we need to be cognizant of is when you start deleting, Salesforce will start locking other objects. And actually, case is one of the worst objects to delete, because when you delete a case, it locks both the account and the contact. So remember before where I talked about data skew and I said there was millions of cases on this one account? Well, when you started deleting things and you were trying to delete 2 cases at once, well, this would lock the account and the second delete would fail because it would say, oh, that account is already locked. So you run into needing to use the batch size of how you delete, how many records you delete at once, along with the bulk API so that you can do things in parallel. So this is an example of you can control how many cases were deleted at one time. The max you can do is 10,000. We found that a number in this customer's particular instance was around 2,000. So we did 2,000 cases at once. We deleted a lot of things in parallel. We would end up with delete errors. So some things would lock each other. That's where retry logic comes into play. With inside of the bulk API, you can actually ask it to automatically retry up to 15 times. So we would retry some things, but then at the end, there would be cases that didn't delete and those would fall out. And what happened was that's where we helped identify the data skew, because these cases would keep falling out with blocks and other weird errors. And then in investigating, we found, oh, wow, there's a lot of data skew. So what actually happened was now, instead of taking some of these cases and deleting in parallel, deleting with the bulk API, we took the ones that falled out and put them back in again with serial. So we were actually deleting in several different ways, the bulk in parallel with a hard delete, and then the bulk in serial, and then anything that fell out, we actually went through the SOAP API one record at a time. So it's really interesting how you can use different ways that Salesforce works and actually get better performance in delete. Like normally you would say, oh, if I'm going to delete things, I don't want any errors. In this example, by embracing the errors and taking different paths for what the failure conditions were, I was able to reach higher throughput, higher performance overall than just saying, oh, I should just delete everything serial, avoid errors, and it takes 20 hours to delete instead of doing it in 4 hours, having a lot of errors, and then only handling the exceptions at the end. So a little counterintuitive, but one way you can work within the Salesforce system. So questions there?
What is the maximum throughput achieved by using all these methods?
So what's interesting about that is what you are deleting doesn't determine throughput. So the bulk API, whether you're using REST, whether you're using SOAP, what you have to think about is inside of your Salesforce org, you've created automations, whether that be Apex triggers, whether that be flows, if you still have process builders, workflows. So if I have those things set up on delete, every time I delete a record, all of that is going to fire. So if it takes a second for any automations to fire, well, it's going to take 20 million seconds to delete 20 million records. So in order to maximize that throughput, you also need to think about having the right bypasses in place. Most people are familiar with a trigger handler framework where you can turn off triggers for particular users, turn it off for the delete process. But think about your declarative based automations and having those things too. In this particular instance, what ended up happening, the customer wanted to minimize deletions during the work week. So we would run a set of 100,000 deletes each night in serial mode. So it didn't lock, didn't affect any users. And then in the weekend, from roughly, we'll say 6 p.m. on a Friday till midnight on a Sunday, we would delete in parallel. And over a weekend, we would delete several million records. So probably 1 to 2 million records in, what would it be? It would be roughly a 18 and 12. So, 24 to 36 hour window. But it's not just tied to like how many records can you push in the API. It's what's going on in your Salesforce org that's going to determine how much throughput you can get. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Carl, throughout the years, I haven't been to Salesforce that long, maybe 6 years. The data skill is still pretty much the same number. Do you think that's going to be anything on the, I wouldn't say hardware, but probably on the algorithm in there or deeply in the engineering that would make that 10,000 go somewhere? Because, data is readily available today. You look into things like a TikTok, Instagram. They multiply that by, by the seconds. Before I finish my question here, there's going to be probably another 2 million records in there. So do you think there's something in the future for that?
So I don't have a Salesforce crystal ball. I feel like the fact that it has stayed at that level for so long, it's something very fundamental to the Salesforce platform of, yes, we're using powerful databases underneath, and that in a database you can put millions of records and you can query it out, and those sort of problems don't arise. But a database doesn't give you that declarative customization, right? You can put 50 fields on here and create all these crazy relationships between objects and make them go in circles and back to themselves with a few clicks in a few hours, right? So I think there's something fundamental with having that mass customization with very easy tooling, that the trade-off is now you're gonna kind of be stuck with 10,000 record SKU limit for the foreseeable future. I don't know exactly how they've built that, but it just feels like, to your point, that this has persisted for so long that it's tied into that fundamental way that everything is customized. One example, when you start adding custom fields to an object, you end up like a standard object, or you end up with 2 tables. You end up with the account table in the Oracle database that has the standard fields in it. And then you add up with like account custom, which has the fields you added to it. So from a database perspective, if I'm going to give you back those fields, well, I have to join 2 tables. And those 2 tables don't have just your tenants information. They have all the tenants on that particular pod, right? So there's a cost in doing that. That's why when we talk about large data volumes, if your reports are slow or you're having problems with list views, you can create a skinny table. Salesforce will enable that for you. And what happens is it takes those fields and it merges it into one table. So now when you're running a report or doing a list view, you don't have to do a join in the database. So that saves you performance. So that's where I think, there's something in the layers that makes that 10,000 something we're going to see for the foreseeable future. And maybe we go to Dreamforce and I'm wrong. Happily be wrong, but it just feels that way from the outside.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? All right, so we're in the delete phase, and guess what? Files are still hard when it comes to deletes. So we got everything out, we got the files out, we delete our case, but guess what? That doesn't delete the file. The file sits by itself as content document. When you delete the case, it only deletes the one content document link record. When you add a file, you actually get two content document links at least. You get one that links to the object that it was created on, and one that is like a share to all users. So in order to get content documents out, you have to delete each one of those separate from the parent cases. So in this case, we had to go and create another process that says, oh, these were the content documents that I received. And here's the delete operations Salesforce to do it. Nice thing about it, there was not as much contention or locking in when you're deleting files. So you're able to push this through the bulk API. You're able to push it in parallel with pretty high batches. So you could do the 10,000 at a time here. So files were fairly speedy. But again, another consideration, if you just go in and you're like, oh, I deleted the case. Yep, file looks good. I don't see it. Okay, mission accomplished. It really isn't, because you had to look in the other way and say, oh, wow, it's still here. There's this other content document link that links to something else that still exists in Salesforce. So that's something that can definitely trip you up if you're not there looking for it. I alluded to this before, but with a global business, when do you do deletes? There aren't any off hours. Considering those locks really come into play, because there was data skew, really bad data skew. When we deleted a case, we locked the account. So users, service reps that were trying to create a case would get errors, unable to obtain lock on the record. And you don't want that to happen inside of your Salesforce org. So in this case, it was splitting the process. So I talked about the 3 phases. We had the identification. The identification could run at any time. We would take records and we put them in a table and say, this is what we need to process. The archiving could run at any time. It would read a batch of records from the table. It could process in parallel, put those things off. It would run 24 hours. And then the deletes, they got split. Like I said, in the business week, we would delete cases with the bulk API in serial mode. So it went slow, but we could at least get a little data out. And then on the weekend, we'd do it in bulk. We would have the locks come up. That's okay, because the system wasn't as heavily used, and we could keep going there. So separating out the process became really important. The thought that comes is, well, what if there are no off hours? What if you're running through the weekends too, and you don't have that window? And that's where you then have to trade off pure performance for some of these other considerations. Like, okay, we're gonna focus on the cases that have skew. We're gonna eventually archive everything so you don't have skew. Oh, by the way, customer, please start a round robin process. Please create new accounts. Don't further propagate the skew, and eventually you can get down and then you can run things. There was a question in the chat about the deletion. Do we use the bulk API or a batch job? It was the bulk API because we were taking things outside of the system. So it was easy to then just send a bulk with the set of IDs that you wanted to delete it. If you were doing something completely on platform, you do have to deal with the governor limits and how long Apex can run and move to schedule and batch Apex. So, it's possible, but having Odiseva as the platform I was using, we had a lot of the things built in to handle that processing as well too. The next, what archival strategy did you use? Could you elaborate on that for a second?
So, did you go with a data warehouse or an AWS server?
Gotcha.
Or how did
Yes.
you end up archiving the data before moving to delete?
So if we go back to the identification step, in this particular customer's case, they looked at what was happening with email to case, and they found 3 scenarios. The first scenario was when somebody sent a response to a customer, they'd get an auto response. Hey, I'm out of the office until September. That they deemed a junk case, not a valid case that anybody needed to act on, but something that got created in the system. The second was what they called a no action case, like, oh, you invoiced me incorrectly, or yes we did, we're not going to take an action on it, or nobody from the customer side responded to the first email. And then the third was any case that was closed within, it started at 12 months, it moved to 9 months. I think now it's at 6 months. So the first 2 were ones that they said, hey, we don't need to keep these. After a month in junk or 3 months in no action, just put these into the file. So those went into a file system, into an S3 bucket that could be searched if something was needed, but generally were never touched again. The ones that were within a year or less, those went into a live archive, into a database where you could actually view it inside of Salesforce. So you would look at the account, and there'd be a related list of cases, and right below it would be a related list of cases in the archive, and you could click and you could view the record. So it was actually a multi-tiered archive strategy based off of the type of data that you're needing to archive. And that's actually fairly typical. And what's even more typical is having a life cycle where you say, I'm going to move this to a live or warm storage for a period of time. Hey, we need that case. We need to keep it for a year. And then after a year, move it out into cold. So tiering your data can be pretty common as well, too.
Awesome. Thank you.
And then whichever way you do it, think about restore. And that sounds kind of weird. Hey, we're doing all this to archive and to get around limits. But if you remove it, you probably will need to put it back at some point in time. Oh, we closed that case accidentally. That shouldn't have been removed. Or, oh, this object that we told you we wanted to be archived, we didn't know some other team was using it in a different way, and we need to put those back. And I had those situations where I needed to restore information from an archive and put it into Salesforce. And again, waiting until it's needed it's too late, because restore can be tricky. I can just throw off a few simple examples. I create a case today, I archive it. Tomorrow, I add a new required custom field on that case. How do I restore the data that I archived yesterday? Because it didn't have that field, and that field's now required. Or I change a field type, or I add new custom objects, right? So you have to be very cognizant of what's going to trip you up, not just things like this, but again, we talked about automations on delete. What about automations on insert? Do you send an email to a customer when a new case gets created? Well, do you want to do that when you restore from an archive? Probably not. So thinking through those things, having a plan for restore as part of your archive strategy is definitely a lesson that I learned along the way. Questions there?
No questions, but that's a good question. Like, so what do you do when you get a field where that's a new field and it's required now? Like,
yeah. So one of the things, again, being that I work for Otiseva and our platform, we've designed to deal with these challenges. We give the option of setting a fixed value on restore. So if you have a field, let's just say you have to have something in this pick list, you can put a default value. You could specify, oh, I want everything to show pending, and it'll restore with that value in it. So there's ways where if you were doing it without a tool, you'd need to put that value in and make sure that field is populated. If you have something to assist you along the way, there's built-in kind of best practices to get around some of these restore roadblocks. The biggest one is automations, right? In my mind, because you can come up with ways to put placeholder data or do different things, but if you have workflows, if you have flows, if you have processes, triggers firing in an org, you don't really have a good way of turning that off. Yes, you could disable everything, but if you disable everything, then the business isn't going to function. So you're going to have to lock everybody out. You really want to make sure you have the bypasses built in. That's an important step in making sure you can get data back in without affecting things unintentionally.
makes sense. Thank you.
All right, so if I were to recap what I went through, you start by knowing the why. Why did you want to archive? That's going to lead into the strategy that you're going to go about. You have to think about those big numbers because it's going to come at you fast, and there's only so many hours in the day to run these processes, and you can't always interfere with the business, and the data will start piling up. Whether it's the archive strategy or the restore strategy, planning for these things before you need them is so important. Having that discussion, making it part of your requirements gathering checklist. Hey, we're putting new things in Salesforce. Great. When are we taking it out? Knowing Salesforce in and out, right? Don't work against it, whether it's retrieving data or dealing with queries, knowing how it deletes, all those things you have to be able to use Salesforce to your advantage. As we saw, files are hard, both getting it out and deleting it. So if you can avoid putting files in Salesforce, it might not be a bad thing. Think about if there are going to be off hours or not with global businesses now, and then don't overlook restore. You're going to have to think about putting data back, which sounds counterintuitive when you're working to take it out. So those were the lessons that I learned. Happy to hang on the line and see if there's any other follow-up or related questions that we want to tackle today together.
I want to say it was really refreshing because I took a look. I took a look on the architect certification for data, and I fell really in love because it is something that I have done prior to Salesforce. I came from the mainframe world, and a lot of stuff in there. It wasn't relational like it is Oracle, but it was an inverted list or DB2 or some other stuff in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I could identify. I haven't taken that certification just for lack of either. I take the plunge and do or find the time, but that this presentation, it really resonates with a lot of I have seen in there. So for my side, I want to say thank you because it was really reinforcing a lot of issues that I have seen.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's my pleasure. One of the things I think we over-focus on Salesforce is metadata, right? Because it is so metadata driven. But the way you know your customer as a business is the data that they entrust in you, right? And being able to have that data available and safe and secure is really important. So I'm always excited to talk about data-related topics.
Hi, Carl. Just a question around the archival side of things.
Mhm.
So you mentioned that you were working with the live archival, where the business was essentially able to view the
Yes.
archive data. How was the security sort of perforated through the archived data? So obviously within Salesforce we have a full security framework as to which person should have access to which records, which fields, and so on and so forth. How is that perforated into the archive data, especially if you have cases which are, let's say, sensitive and only a certain specific group of people should have access to it?
Mhm. So there's a couple of things. If you think about how Salesforce does security, when you take all the different rules, it actually writes it into a table where you have access information about that particular field. So let's just say for a second we could replicate that into another system. The problem is the second that it leaves Salesforce, it's no longer being maintained. So when you change your sharing rules or you add a group or you remove a role, your other system would no longer reflect that. So trying to replicate the Salesforce security model doesn't work too well once you've archived it out. If you've ever worked with Einstein Analytics or CRM Analytics, Tableau CRM, Wave, same product, they had a concept called security predicates, which was a way to specify essentially a where clause, right? To say, if it's this user, only show me records in analytics where their user ID matches this particular field in the analytics data set. It's that same type of approach with archived. If you want to put security on it, is you need to have that source system filter out based off of some criteria what it sends back to you. So it's not as robust as the Salesforce security model, but it gives you something that is close. Because again, remember, you're usually archiving because you've hit some type of other obstacle that you can't get around. So you're willing to make that trade-off and say, yes, I need Salesforce to be, I need it to work. I need it to be able to put more cases in. Therefore, I'm going to be okay with a little bit less security on it. If it's, hey, I have to have the Salesforce security model, well, then that's probably not data you should archive, because you're never going to have anything that mimics that when you go to the external systems. But the security predicate type approach is what I've seen work well.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Since emails were not going out, or Salesforce was not able to receive any emails, was system down for some time? And how you handled that situation where no one is able to use the system?
So I wasn't as familiar with the specifics of the incident that the customer incurred. My understanding is incoming emails were still residing in like an Outlook mailbox somewhere. So they did have the ability to re-import those, so they didn't lose incoming cases, but they weren't able to do outbound communication to their customers. So from that perspective, yes, the Salesforce system was down during that period of time until they found the issue, got a limit increase, and then the emails started flowing again. Now, what's interesting, I'm going to pull up, I think I still have this. There's another limit that comes into play, which is the maximum number of files and versions in a 24-hour period. So not only is there a limit of how many files you can create, you can only create 200,000 new files in a day. So they actually had to have this limit increased as well too. So once this one went up, they got around that. But then as their email volumes grew, there were some days where they were doing more than 200,000 new files a day from email to case. So then you start solving the problem in a different way, right? You start looking and saying, well, how do I stop files from hitting Salesforce? How do I move from standard email to case to a custom email handler that's going to look and say, oh, do I already have this file? Let's just make a reference to it. Or, oh, I already have this file. I don't need it. Let's just discard it. So you can start tackling the problem in different ways, because you may notice, where is it? There's another limit that comes into play. I believe it's this one, 2000. I may not have the right one, but there's a limit on the number of links that you can create to a file. So you can't take one file and point it to 10 million things. You have to then make multiple copies of it and point it to 2,000 at a time. So you can get into some pretty obscure things as you start trying to plan ways to resolve this at the source rather than waiting to archive, because it's always better to prevent something to happen than to try and deal with it after the fact.
Thank you, Carl.
My pleasure.
So this is potentially an issue for almost any client with a large number of cases. Email to case situations, right, Carl? So in such cases, like, is there anything that Salesforce is working on, like limiting uploading this LinkedIn images and then Facebook images and all those things as?
I'm not aware of anything that I've seen published. I know moving to the custom email handler so that you can implement logic. I've heard several customers that have done that, whether they're either ignoring or they're preventing the duplicates from being created. That's been a common pattern that I've seen. There's the ability, so each file actually has a checksum. You can use checksum to determine. Fortunately, checksum is a standard field that cannot be indexed, so you actually have to create your own version of checksum, and then you can index it and do some things for performance reasons. But I'm not aware of anything on the immediate roadmap that would change the way email to case works. It's just a consideration if you're going to have a lot of volume. If you're going to do 1,000 cases a day, it's probably not going to hit you. But if you're going to do 200,000 cases, then yeah, you're going to hit that point where that's a big issue.
Okay. So what are the tools that you used for kind of hard deleting and then migrating the data? Is it a custom platform, or is it
Yeah.
anything like MuleSoft?
So our platform was Odiseva, the company I work for.
Okay.
The way we do it is through the APIs. So there's nothing secret or there's a special Odiseva API in the Salesforce. It's using REST, it's using bulk, but using it intelligently and knowing where you're going to have challenges with data or relationships or deletes, and having the parameters that you can adjust and say, okay, for this particular object, I want to delete 2,000 in bulk, and this other object, I want to do 10,000, and having the system process that and handle errors and have retry logic for errors. So you can build all of it on your own, or you can look for a platform that's already built some of that in there. And that's, the challenges that I'm going and solving from customer to customer. So fortunately, I have a platform that helps.
Is the tool name itself is Odiseva?
Yes.
Oh.
So I can put it into the chat.
Yeah, appreciate it, because thank you.
Hey, Carl. I've got 2 questions, and I apologize if you'd discussed this earlier. I joined quite late today. So if you did, I can just refer me back to the video and I can watch it of the recording. I guess the first gap that I'm having is that conceptually, I guess I'm struggling with large data volume as it relates to, as it kind of relates to like batch jobs versus like the bulk API. So when I think of, we have our transactions in normal Apex, it's limited in a trigger size of 200, or if we have a batch size, we have 200 records of our chunking that we can go through for each execute statement, and then from there we can do more. But when we talk about the bulk API, we have more power, more throughput. When we're talking about large data volume, I'm kind of getting lost here about, is large data volume more about the throughput? Is it more? I'm kind of getting lost there. I mean, I've been reading the trailheads and I've been going through it, but I'm still a little shaky. And then the second question is, can you talk specifically around some of the exceptions that you reach and mapping them to data issues? So like unable to lock row is one. Maybe there's timeout issues. Maybe we're doing a cascade delete and we're getting way too many records that are getting deleted. Can you kind of talk through those exceptions and how to kind of map them to where we may be messing up?
So I think your answer to large data volumes is yes, and that's not helpful. But what I mean by that is it affects you in a lot of different areas. So if you are looking at something like reports or list views, then it's the read aspect of large data volumes. And are you being selective with queries, and do you have the indexes in place so that you're getting data back quickly? There's I don't remember where I've seen it, but there's guidance from Salesforce that says, if you're doing list views, your list views really shouldn't return more than 2,000 records. And I don't think I've ever consciously designed towards something like that, but that's probably right, because if you're trying to find a record to operate on in more than 2,000, like you probably have lost.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect of it, right? Then there's the aspect of large data volumes where you are trying to put things into Salesforce, so the integration aspect. And now it moves to different things like the data SKU that we talked about, ownership SKU, because when you are changing data in Salesforce, now you're going to start locking records and locking related records, or locking a record because you have a trigger that executes and does something. So that kind of is a different way that large data volumes manifest itself, if that makes sense. Yes, it can be hard to report on things. Yes, it can be hard to integrate things, because if I add a case, I'm going to lock the account in the contact.
Yep.
Well, if I'm adding a case and I have logic that takes 9 seconds to run, that account and contacts locked for a pretty long time, which affects the next user or the other integration process that's doing it in parallel. And now you get that other error. And oh, by the way, when that case gets created, now sharing rules have to run. It has to evaluate the sharing criteria and it has to populate that. So it can cause a lot of ripple effects there. And then my version of it has been the delete, which I would say it's similar to the insert type of thing, but it's a little bit different. When you're different operation, but same concept of what's locking and what can affect. When I think about batch Apex, I think of it as like on platform integration, if that makes sense. Like you've decided, oh, these 10,000 things have aged out and I need to change a field from this value to that value, right? So you could do that either on platform with batch, or you could take it off platform and put it back in through the APIs. What usually becomes the deciding factor or decision point is how much processing are you going to do on it? Because you're always going to be constrained inside of Salesforce with runtime limits and Apex execution and that sort of thing. If you go off platform, you can take 10 minutes to process it, and that's fine. It's just then now you need to go back and forth with the APIs. The bulk APIs, pretty robust. There used to be 10,000 batches. Now there's 15,000 batches. It's different on whether you're inserting data versus you're reading data. Reading data, you can get a lot more information out. I've done backups on orgs with 2 billion records in it, and pulled everything out. So you can get a lot out and then process it without worrying about Salesforce limits and then push it back in. So it's not always one or the other. It's kind of looking at the use case. And I've done both. The identification process that I said at the start, that runs as batch Apex on Salesforce because it wants to look at criteria and put records into a table. So that stays on platform, but then everything else goes off platform to process and then figure out what to delete and send the deletes back in. The second question, as far as error patterns, definitely, locking records from things being executed in parallel. That's probably the most common one. There was weird errors about, oh gosh, what was it? Something around like duplicate record, which is something you should only see on insert, but it was happening on delete and it was tied to the data SKU. There was, you mentioned deleting too many things. Yes, sometimes when there was a record that had the data SKU, if you tried to delete it, it was receiving too many deletes at one time, and that was becoming a related error. There was a really obscure thing. It's possible to create a file in Salesforce that then Salesforce cannot read back to you. So with email to case, if you ended up with a email that had Chinese characters, like Chinese characters after a dot, those Chinese characters became the file extension in content document, and Salesforce would give you an invalid type error if you tried to retrieve it back. So there are things like that occurred that I've never seen before, and you may not ever see, but really corner cases of things that come up when you're dealing with billions of records. Yeah, you're going to hit the 1 in a billion case when you have that much data that you're dealing with.
So it sounds like the primary ones were the unable to lock rows.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cascade delete, and then the duplicate errors, and then this corner case.
Absolutely.
Cool. Hey, thanks for the answer in the first question. That kind of clears up some confusion I was having earlier.
Yeah, and when you're going through the material, it's looking at what the remediation is because it's solving a particular thing. A skinny table that I mentioned earlier about combining the two things, that doesn't help you with importing data. And in fact, it hurts you a little bit because you have to write it at two places when you insert something in Salesforce, but it absolutely helps you when you're reading in a list view or a report. So that's the other thing, is like looking at what they recommend as a corrective action, because it's going to tie to the category of where the article is saying large data volume is going to hurt you.
Got it. That makes sense. Thanks, Carl.
Yep.
All right, we have we have nine people here, including Carl and myself. Any other questions? Anything else that we should add? I mean, it's not often that we've been planning this session with Carl for several months. If you folks have any questions, please post, speak up with a small group now. Otherwise, I'm gonna call the session. This recording will be available later on the Salesforce Architect Group Tampa on the Trailblazer community. The same, I will post it on the LinkedIn using my profile, of course. There's also Salesforce Architect Group Twitter and Salesforce Architect Group in YouTube as well. So everything is going to be available in there. And if we don't have any more questions, I want to say thank you not just to Carl, but to everybody that took the time to hang in there. I walk away with a tons of things, and I hope you do the same.
Thanks, everybody.
We good? Bye-bye, everybody. See you next month. See you. No, next month. Next month we're skipping. Next event is going to be the beginning of October. September is once a month. We skip once or twice a month. Next time it will be the first Wednesday of October. All right. Thanks again.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.